In the busy streets of post-war Amsterdam, a man named Frits Adriaanse lived two very different lives. By day, he was a friendly cafe owner, serving drinks and chatting with customers. But at night, Frits became someone else entirely. This is the story of how a poor boy from a big family grew up to become one of Amsterdam's most notorious criminals. It's a story of daring sea voyages, secret codes, and millions of dollars worth of hashish. Join us as we explore the double life of Frits van de Wereld, the man who outsmarted the police and built an empire on the high seas. How did this simple cafe owner become the king of hash smuggling? And how did it all come crashing down? Get ready for an exciting journey through the history of the Dutch underworld. This is the true story of Frits Adriaanse, cafe owner by day, hash smuggler by night. Frits van de Wereld was born on March 27, 1927, in Amsterdam North, as Simon Frederik Adriaanse. The Adriaanse family from Amsterdam had no fewer than 11 brothers and sisters. His father dealt in stolen goods and was arrested by the Germans. While his father was in prison, it fell to Frits to support the family. He did so in the same manner as his father, which led to him being imprisoned multiple times during his teenage years. However, this did not deter him, and Frits continued with what he knew best, as it was ingrained in him from a young age. The family he grew up in faced severe financial hardship, struggling to make ends meet and barely having enough to eat. Frits did whatever he could to provide food for them. After World War II, he worked as a cleaner at the docks and also drove an unlicensed taxi. He devised various ways to make money, showing himself to be versatile, enterprising, and forming numerous contacts. He eventually started working as a doorman in the Amsterdam red light district, doing various jobs for the gambling houses there. In this neighborhood, he quickly got to know the pimps and their girls. It's like a small village where everyone knows each other. Many streetwalkers worked between Halvemanssteeg and Amstelstraat. Aunt Sjaan and Aunt Bep worked on Groenburgwal, and Aunt Jenny even waited for customers in the rain on Stalstraat. Frits also knew the pimps, who protected them well. Frits married Hendrika Everdina Horstman, and in May 1951, they had a son, Reinier Bernardus. When he bought the Café de Wereld on Zeedijk in 1956, everyone started calling him Frits van de Wereld. The café quickly became popular, and the Amsterdam underworld enjoyed drinking there. Frits decided to expand his business, adding rooms above the cafe for his own girls to work in. During this time, he met hashish dealers and began trading. Frits van de Wereld was skilled in many areas and continues to rise. In 1968, he joined the cigarette smuggling trade, working with well-known figures from the Amsterdam underworld like Gijs van Dam, Maurits de Vries, gambling hall owner Jerry H., Pietje P., and Bertus from Utrecht. Frits moved away from small-scale hash trading and rapidly expanded into the large-scale sea transport of hash. This activity was predominantly controlled by former fishermen and fishmongers from Volendam and Den Helder in the past. Frits and his partner, Willem B., oversaw the shipping of hash on the vessel De Spurt, which was owned by real estate traders from Amsterdam. They funded these transports themselves and generated substantial profits. In January 1973, the coastal vessel Spurt near Lisbon received 1,300 kilos of hashish from the yacht Tahina. The yacht had run aground and the crew of the Spurt came to its aid. However, on the return journey to the Netherlands, the Spurt also suffered damage off the coast of France. The ship sailed to the port of Benaudet in Brittany. Once the Spurt was in port, the Dutch crew returned home. The French customs were alerted and conducted an investigation, discovering and seizing the hashish. Despite this failure, another journey was soon prepared, as indicated in the police report. Between April and May 1973, the ship Ijmuiden E traveled to Lebanon, where 3,000 kilos of hashish were collected. This shipment was unloaded at Audeschild on Texel and transported by vans to an unknown destination. The crew of the Ijmuiden I each received 10,000 guilders from Frits van der Wereld. It appeared to be a lucrative smuggling route, and another transport was planned. However, the risks were evident. During this transport in August 1973, the crew of the Ijmuiden I loaded 6,000 kilos of hashish in Lebanon. But on the return journey, they encountered difficulties with the Algerian Coast Guard. In panic, they threw the 6,000 kilos of hashish overboard. The financiers, including Frits van der Wereld, Mooi Willem, and the Volendammers CM and JS, decided to approach things differently after this debacle and sought a new boat. The choice for the next journey fell on a cutter, the HD 160, belonging to skipper Doris Pompert. The financiers bought the ship from Pompert and promised that he could buy it back after the expedition's success. On January 6, 1974, CM and Frits Adriaanse, alias Frits van der Wereld, flew to Beirut to make arrangements with a certain Joosoof for the purchase of hashish and its transport to the Netherlands. 2 days later, the men returned to Schiphol. For the expedition with the HD 160, CM and JS made several trips to Den Helder to inspect the preparations. Arie Dekker, working with the military police in Den Helder, received a tip about something suspicious involving a fishing cutter in the harbor. Dekker had previously received information from the Amsterdam police about an imminent transport. Dekker and another investigator observed the Lammie. Just before the Lammie departed, they were well informed. We knew who the crew were, how much motor oil was on board, which sea charts he had, and how much food was being taken. And also very important, there were rubber boats on board. They must have had plans for those, Dekker said. On the day the Lammie departed, Dekker checked to see if he could spot the boat leaving. I thought, there he goes, and we know everything. The Lammie sailed through the Channel, the Bay of Biscay, and past Gibraltar across the Mediterranean to Lebanon. They first docked at Rhodes, where Adriaanse and his wife joined them. From Rhodes, the Lammie sailed to Lebanon. Dekker explained, on the border of Lebanon and Syria, there's an oil refinery and a beacon. They had to sail towards it, and that's where they were supposed to receive the hashish. But it didn't work out. The hashish wasn't at the designated location. There were some problems with the supplier. The crew steered the boat into the port of Rhodes during heavy weather. According to the Amsterdam police's tapped conversations, Adriaanse called JS and said, "It went terribly on Rhodes and in Lebanon. They wandered around aimlessly for 5 days. Awful weather. We sailed in with force 11 winds. The boat was damaged and had to be repaired. After the repairs, the crew waited for further instructions, though it was unclear when the hashish would be delivered. Eventually, the 3 crew members of the Lammie were allowed to return to the Netherlands briefly. After about a week, the problems seemed resolved, and the trio flew back to Rhodes. Dekker noted, they flew to Rhodes and boarded the Lammie again. They received word that they had to go to Lebanon. They got the hashish on board and immediately set sail back. From that moment, it would take about 20 to 21 days before they would reach the Dutch coast. The investigation team was put on alert, with the big question being where the hashish would be brought ashore. Meanwhile, the demand for hashish in the Netherlands seemed to be growing. The tapped conversations from Frits Adriaanse's home phone revealed that several involved parties who had a financial stake in the transport were contacting Frits. A drug dealer from Heusden called and spoke to his wife. "When is it summer?" he asked. Fritz's wife said it wasn't happening anytime soon. The man from Heusden then asked, "Will it take long?" Mrs. Adriaanse said she couldn't say and ended the conversation. A woman named Truce also called, asking Frits if he still had any hashish. "The first week or 10 days, I've got nothing. It's all so risky," Frits replied. As weeks passed, the Lammie was on its return journey. The tapped conversations indicated the boat was on its way. Frits called Mrs. CM and said he couldn't sleep, asking if she had heard anything, but she hadn't. Frits cryptically said, "Next time I'll go horseback riding myself." Mrs. CM understood and laughed. Frits ended the conversation with a few curses. The phone rang again. It was CM. "Everything okay?" Frits asked. "No," CM responded. "God damn it. How could this happen? What time was it supposed to be there?" Frits asked. CM remained silent and then said he would come by tomorrow. On April 24th at 10 minutes to 2 in the morning, Frits received a call. "I was in the paper warehouse tonight and nothing." Frits replied, "God damn it. We'll try again tomorrow. Good night." Meanwhile, various police, judiciary, navy, and customs officers were anxiously waiting for the cutter. On Thursday, April 18th, there was a briefing at the customs office in Haarlem for all involved parties. Approximately 100 people were involved in the secret operation to intercept the hashish transport and capture the key figures behind it. On Sunday morning, April 21st, the Navy ship Haar Majesteit Wolf sailed southward to intercept the Lammie. Lieutenant Ben Schmidt of the Water Police in Amsterdam accompanied as a liaison officer. The Navy quickly spotted the cutter on the radar and followed it at a safe distance. They briefly lost sight of it, but soon had the fishing boat back in view. Schmidt said, "We thought it was heading to Zealand, so we warned the police there. Alarm phase 1. Ships were manned, lighthouses were staffed, the whole circus began to operate. Indeed, it sailed several miles eastward, but then turned north again. It probably wanted to stay closer to the coast for easier navigation. From there, it headed north, toward Kalantzug." Josephus Jitta, a prosecutor from Alkmaar, was one of those involved and heard a few days after the briefing that the ship was heading towards North Holland. "There was a call and I heard, the hashish boat in question has been spotted and it's coming to the Alkmaar district, likely near Den Helder." Jitta heard this at the police headquarters in Den Helder. He also knew that a group was stationed in the dunes and that the customs boat De Zeerend was at sea. "At some point, we received reports that the radar had detected something at sea heading towards the shore. It turned out to be a rubber boat heading to the beach. It stopped on the beach at Kalantzug, and then something returned. Something had been brought ashore, and it was found that vans were waiting nearby. The items from the beach were taken to the vehicles." Jitta was asked by the police leadership if there was now enough reason to proceed with arrests. "Well, I had to think about that," Jitta recalled. "I understood that if arrests were made too early, it could be a problem, and if they were made too late, that could also be an issue. The timing had to be just right." On the night of April 25th, Frits Adriaanse called Mrs. CM at 4:45 a.m. Neither of them could sleep, both waiting for news. Frits decided to visit Mrs. CM. When he arrived, he called his wife and said, "Good morning, Moose. The horse is in the stable." But that wasn't entirely accurate. Moei Willem called Adriaanse's home and said, "Half the horse is there." The Helder military police officer Ari Dekker clearly remembers the conversations about horseback riding, though it wasn't clear at the time what was meant. They talked about horseback riding, and we couldn't place the word horseback riding. We later discovered that the horse was the cargo, and horseback riding was the landing on the coast. That became clear then. Half the horse had been brought ashore, and the other half was still on board the Lammie. The police arrested the drivers of the vans. It then became apparent to the organizers that the unloading of the first half of the cargo hadn't gone as planned. At around 8 in the morning, Mrs. CM called Mrs. Adriaanse and asked if Frits was home yet. He wasn't. Mrs. CM informed her that her husband and JS had been arrested. Immediately after this call, Mrs. Adriaanse contacted the dealer in Houston and reported that CM and JS had been arrested. The dealer asked, with or without something. Mrs. Adriaanse didn't know and asked if he could let her know if Frits arrived there. When Frits arrived in Houston, he called his wife and asked what was going on. He responded nonchalantly to her story, saying there was nothing to worry about. However, he was wrong because shortly after, the dealer from Houston called Mrs. Adriaanse and told her that Frits had been caught. The dealer said, "There was a load in the back of Frits' van. 2 bags, I think 50. Meanwhile, the Lammie continued its journey. The final destination was unclear, but the involved law enforcement officers were determined to apprehend the crew. Through the radio, the Lammie was requested to stop just off the coast near Den Helder, but there was no response. The HM Wolf fired a warning shot, a serious caution. The shot landed a bit ahead of the Lammie, but the message was clear. Josephus Jitta commented, "It was the first time our Navy fired a shot since the conflict with Indonesia over New Guinea." Even this did not impress them, so the Navy ship nudged the Lammie and fired a tear gas grenade into the wheelhouse. The crew ducked down. Meanwhile, Lieutenant at Sea J.W. Kelder had prepared for a boarding, but it didn't come to that. Kelder said, "We distanced ourselves with our ship, and the 3 crew members reappeared and showed that they didn't intend to surrender. They likely fixed the rudder and headed to the lower deck." More shots were fired from the Navy ship. The forward control of the engine was shut off, causing the diesel to stop. The crew tried to get the diesel running again, but it didn't work, so they opened the seacocks. The Lammie began taking on water and started to sink. The 3 men got into a rubber boat. It didn't take long before the Lammie, about 60 kilometers off the coast of Den Helder, disappeared beneath the waves. The crew rowed to the customs boat, the Wereld, and were arrested. Liaison Officer Ben Schmidt transferred from the Wolf to the Wereld. We took them on board, had coffee together, and had a chat. They said they were out there sea fishing. But when Schmidt made it clear that they were well informed, the 3 detained crew members admitted that there was still about 2,000 kilos of hashish on board. The cutter was lying at a depth of about 40 meters. There was a great fear that skilled divers would go to the boat, so Public Prosecutor Josephus Jitta decided to have the Lammie raised soon. A few days later it was done, and the Lammie was hoisted and towed to the port of Den Helder. The cargo was removed from the hold and consisted of 1,600 kilos of hashish and 27 hot water bottles containing a total of 40 liters of hashish oil. 1 liter of oil could produce 1,000 joints. The total street value of this transport was 25 million guilders in 1974. Frits van der Wereld and Mooi Willem were sentenced to 21 months in prison. Doris Pompert and his crew received 12 months, and the shipper and CM were sentenced to 18 months each. This operation eventually led to the establishment of the Coast Guard. After Frits had served his sentence, he had a new smuggling target. He wanted to smuggle heroin, and in the fall of 1975, he sought out Gietje B, also known as Blonde Griet. She was to approach a gambling house owner to set up a deal for him. The owner of the gambling house was Ling Kioi K, known as Tiger, and one of the largest heroin dealers in the world. According to the American DEA, he was the head of the Wo Lung Hua triad. Blonde Griet established the contact and was paid in heroin for her services. She then sold this heroin in her own cafe, De Zimiu, from where it made its way to the streets through smaller dealers. By 1984, the hash trade continued to allure Frits, leading him to organize another transport. He collaborated with Willem L. and Will L., who was linked to Theo Hooft, the owner of Jaap Yum. Klaas Bruinsma's gang assisted them with the transport. After the transport was discovered, the police launched an investigation, resulting in Frits being sentenced. He received a 6-month prison term, which he served, and then turned his back on crime. With his gambling house, Matahari, he became a multi-millionaire and no longer needed to engage in illegal activities. He was known as a former pimp, brothel owner, and born smuggler. In a rented coffee house on the Zeedijk, he preferred to sit by the window with a hand-rolled cigarette, a cup of coffee, and his dentures on a saucer. He was 69 years old at the time of his death, on December 12, 1996, and he was buried at Zorgvliet Cemetery in Amsterdam. And so ends the incredible story of Frits Adriaanse, the cafe owner who led a double life as Amsterdam's most notorious hash smuggler. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating stories.